It's the lens, it's the lens, it's the lens, gotta live diverse. It's the lens, it's the lens, it's the lens, live diverse. You are listening to The Lens Living Diverse, a podcast brought to you by the CNIB advocacy team. Join Nisha, Vivi, and I as we speak to individuals with intersecting identities who live with sight loss as they share their unique stories. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Lens Living Diverse. I am your host for today. I'll be doing it solo, your host, Ben. And today we have a wonderful episode with such a great guest. And we're going to have an amazing conversation about diversity. And this individual is going to be sharing their story as well as sharing their journey with advocacy and growing up in the different identities. So very excited to have this person on today. So everybody, I want you to welcome Elaine. So Elaine, how are you doing today?
Not too bad. I'd like to thank you very much for having me on here. I'm very honored to be here. I was very grateful to be able to share my story.
Of course, and we're very honored to have you on the Lens Living Diverse as well. So let's get into getting to the audience, getting to know you. So if you could share a little bit about yourself as well as the different identities that you hold.
So first and foremost, I'm a woman. I'm also Korean. My parents came here, escaped from North Korea, we're pretty sure. And then they unfortunately were not able to keep me. And so I was put up for adoption at 6 months. I am totally blind. I have no sight of any kind. It's a congenital birth defect, so I've had it since birth. I also have two children. I'm a single parent. I have a 13-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm also a guide dog user, and I'm also an advocate. I also struggle with mental health issues, and I am, like many blind people, I am probably overeducated and trying to find work.
Definitely, definitely. And I know in the last few months, me and yourself have been working a lot together when it comes to advocacy and in the London community. And I know you're a big advocate in making change for sure for accessibility.
Trying to, yeah. I sit on a few different committees. I am vice chair of the London Accessible Public Service Advisory Committee for Transit, and I've been a member for a number of years. But in my most recent term, when I was reappointed, I decided to go for it and try to become vice chair, and I was elected. So
Oh,
I was quite excited about that. And in the most recent happenings with the APSAC committee, we put into place a pet policy, and it's not perfect, but it's something that I definitely helped to orchestrate, and I proved that policy to help ensure the safety and efficacy for all riders.
definitely. You're doing big things. Shall I call you Madame Chair for the rest of the episode?
No, you don't. You don't need to do that. But no, and then I'm also actually a community, what they call a patient partner volunteer, to help with hospitals and the healthcare system in London. So, sort of a patient volunteer helps with partnering with different organizations and different working groups and communities for objectives that the hospitals and the healthcare initiatives have. And this person helps to shape and sort of decide what policies go into effect, how they become executed, and sort of what changes can be made to improve things for patients in the healthcare system.
Wonderful. Wonderful. As I said, doing such great work in your community, for sure. So I'm just going to move to the first question. So you made mention that you are of Korean descent and you were adopted by a white family, as well as having sight loss. So can you tell us more about that experience? And I know a term, well, I'll let you bring up that term as well, and we could have a conversation about that.
Well, the term that we're, thinking and sort of kind of bandying around, but not wanting to say is gentrification, and the idea that when a person from a different culture is brought up in another country, they take on, sometimes they end up losing the identity of their home country and their home culture, because when they're adopted by a different family of a different culture, they become gentrified. So they start to lose that identity. And unfortunately, in my case, that did happen. I do know that was partially by design. I know that my parents, their intention to put me up for adoption was not because they didn't want to care for me. It was because they knew in the Korean community that it was difficult to try to raise a child who was blind and a woman. I already have an older sister. So for the Korean family, especially in that time, since I was born in 87, that time for a Korean to have a woman and then to also have a blind woman again, not a great idea for the culture. It would have been very frustrating for them. They would have been outsiders. They would have, their friends, they may have lost friends in the community. They may have also had difficulty integrating with the community. So I can understand why they did it. So like I said, it's partially by design. So they were hoping that I could grow up in a white family and I would be able to be afforded opportunities that I wouldn't have if I grew up Korean. Now, as an adult, I would say that I'm happy about it, but not happy about it. There are things that I wish that my parents had done more of. They always were very open and forthright in telling me that I was adopted. They were open and forthright about telling me that I was Korean, but they never really encouraged me or tried to get me involved in the Korean community, even though I do realize that since I am blind, it would have been, again, the idea of being an outsider, and the idea of being ostracized is very possible. But obviously, a white family, it wouldn't matter as much to them as somebody who's actually Korean, which would be me. So, and I am full-blooded Korean. My both of my parents were Korean, so I'm not half. I'm full-blooded. So, anyways, like I said, I feel like my identity was a little bit eroded, just because with having sight loss, my culture has different views on how people with sight loss should be perceived. Some of them would say they're, a little bit old world and a little bit ancient. And it is true. Definitely North America has a more progressive attitude to that, which is great. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that we came from that culture, and how do we try to change that view in our culture, not just in North American culture, but in our culture. And that's sort of why I am kind of sad that I never learned the language and I never got to really get involved in the festivals or parties or activities or foods that my home culture would have indulged in, because I never really got to be a part of that and understand that and sort of have it alongside my Canadian heritage, if you will.
Yeah, and what I find is the fact that you being completely blind, it adds that layer of seeking identity, because you have, for someone else who has sight, where they could recognize people who look like them when they see them out in the community, or they go somewhere and they're like, oh, this is a store that serves Korean food, or a Korean store. So if you could speak on kind of having that layer of sight loss, did that kind of add to you seeking that identity, or lack of
I would say
identity?
I would say yes, for sure. Definitely now that I'm an adult and I'm older, I definitely do, I'm curious. Like, I mean, in school, when we were given the opportunity to research a culture and research another country and its customs and things like that, I mean, the first thing I did was research Korea and find out a little bit more. I'm still very, I would say, very ignorant of really how it is in Korea. I've obviously never been there, and I don't know that many people who are not uh, landed immigrants here, who are who were born in the old country and came here, type of thing.
Mm,
So I can't say that I know that much, but like I said, I have tried to be open to the possibility of looking and learning And definitely, I'm always intrigued by finding out things. I always love how Asian fads and trends end up over here, like the J-pop trend and the K-pop trend and all of that sort of stuff. It always makes me
Hmm.
kind of laugh because it's like it's funny how something that's so normal for somebody who's Asian is so not normal for somebody who's not, and it kind of makes me laugh when, like I said, when kids are jumping up and down to anime and looking at the Japanese video games, and new stuff from Nintendo comes out, and people forget that, yeah, you might play your Nintendo online with all your buddies, but it originally comes from Japan. And that's why the art looks the way it does, and that's why the anime looks the way it does. And my daughter is really interested in anime and stuff like
Mm.
that, and I think that's great.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful culture too. It's an amazing culture for sure. And even wondering, like I know you made mention of you looking to seek out that culture and starting to learn more about it. How have you been doing that recently?
Mostly on my own sort of time and energy, looking on the internet, at things. I've been hesitant, or kind of, I guess, a little bit nervous about looking for Korean social groups because I worry about the fact that I'm not able to speak the language,
Mhm.
and I don't. They could easily, very easily tell that, yes, I look Korean, but I'm not. I always joke that I'm kind of like a banana. I'm, yellow on the outside, but kind of white on the inside, just because of the way I was raised. Um, and I worry that that would prevent me from being able to be really a part of a Korean event or festival. At the same time, though, like I said, the internet is definitely a great place to start, because if I can start talking with people, and I do know that the internet provides wonderful ways of learning languages like Duolingo, and Babbel and stuff like that provide ways of learning the language. And I think that's probably, when I have more time, that because things are quite busy, so it's hard for me to do all of these things at once. But it's definitely on my list of things to pursue. Is I might end up learning Korean, because I think that the best way for me to learn what the culture is like and what the people are like is to be able to speak their language.
And is there any plans in going to visit?
I have never actually like formally planned it, because I definitely wouldn't want to go alone. I would definitely want to go with somebody,
Yeah.
but definitely, I mean, if I could travel and I had, tons of money and I could just do what I wanted, absolutely, I would totally go there. Obviously to South Korea. Not really interested in going to North Korea and meeting Kim Jong
Okay.
Un, but you know, yeah. But like I said, the language is really the way into a culture, as far as I'm concerned. If I may, borrow something from Trevor Noah, I love Trevor Noah, the South African comedian. He
Yes.
is inspiration, and his mother and him, they inspire me. And he often says that the reason that he has learned as many languages as he has is because that he believes that to communicate with the people, you need to speak their language. And so I definitely agree with that, because when you speak their language and when they realize that you speak their language, it really helps to bridge some of that awkwardness gap.
I totally agree. And I know prior we were talking with each other about the Trevor Noah book, Born a Crime. And have you finished the whole book yet, or you're still working on
No, no,
it?
I haven't. See, I'm almost at the point where, like, I don't want to finish it because I don't want it to be
Hmm.
over, because it's just, so I'm actually thinking of restarting it, to be honest, because I did start it like a long time ago and I'd love to go over it again. Just because he's such a prolific writer and he's just so brilliant. And it really puts your life into perspective when you read a memoir like that, because, I think about the day-to-day struggles that I have as somebody with sight loss, as somebody with mental health issues, as somebody, as a single parent. And then I read a book like that and I go, you know what? My life is pretty darn good. I am very grateful for what I have, and I'm very thankful for the people in my life who have supported me, like my parents. Like I said, even though, I do say the word gentrification, and I do mean it. I don't believe it was intentional. It's not something that they, intentionally did. They tried to do their best as far as they could be, to make sure that I knew that I was Korean. They never tried to tell me that I was something I wasn't, and they also never tried to tell me you weren't adopted or you're ours completely. They not that they made me feel that way or anything. It's just that they wanted to make sure that I knew who I was, and who I would be seen like to other people. And by that, I mean, when I would go out in the malls, or with my parents when I was little, my mother used to love to dress me up. I was the little Asian doll, like, almost the way Asians look when we're little, we often look, sort of that doll face, that cute, very, very dress upable, very photogenic, very cute Asian. And so people would see me and they would automatically want to pick me up and hug me and try to
Mm,
bless me, or, tell me and tell my parents how blessed they were.
mm,
And then they would try to bless me and tell me that God would heal me and things like that, when I was little. And so my parents very early on taught me, to say a handshake is great. I don't need to be hugged. I don't need to be picked up. And then, I'm Korean, but I live, I love my parents, and they taught me that, like I said, very early on, how to engage with the community in an appropriate and dignified manner.
exactly. And I find that that's the positive side of when we do speak of gentrification, where uh, you have to do it in the right way, where when you're taking someone out of their culture. And I think of when people go to Africa and they adopt kids from Africa, bring them to this country as white parents. And the one thing I think of is it's not a bad thing, but it's very, very important to know that that kid has the opportunity to know their roots, right? And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I feel like what your parents did by not hiding or sugarcoating, they let you know that you're Korean, right? And they could have
Yes.
easily, as a person who's blind, right, could have
Totally blind.
easily,
They could have easily, yep, they
yeah,
could have
yeah,
easily hidden it or tried to lie, or, waited until I was a certain age to tell me. But no, I cannot remember a time where I didn't know I was Korean and
yeah,
I was, adopted. And
yeah.
that is the way to do it. And I agree, definitely the adoption of children, taking them out of their countries and bringing them here potentially for a better life is a great idea, so long as the parents make sure that they don't lose their culture. And that's the same with, when you encounter people like, vision loss rehab or CNIB in general
Mhm.
is a great place where that can either be reinforced or not. And what I mean by that is when you encounter a vision loss rehabilitation professional and that you tell them you're from another culture, and they sort of open up that dialogue of, oh, well, what culturally relevant things do you want this person to learn with sight loss, so that we can
Mhm.
learn how to accommodate them? So if there's certain foods that culturally you make, so in North America it's not a big thing to cook a pig's head or something like that, but
Yeah.
say it is in another culture, um, instead of the BLR person looking at you and going, no, we don't do that here. If they're open to the dialogue of, okay, I may have never tried this in my life and I may never ever want to try it again, but I will definitely do my best to help you accommodate your child so that they are capable of indulging in a cultural activity. Sort of like the Hawaiians and the luau and stuff like that. That would all be something that, someone growing up in that culture who is blind might, miss out on if they came here and didn't have the appropriate people to support them, to teach them how those customs are done and how that's done. How is the pig buried and, set afire and all of that sort of stuff. Very culturally relevant things for them.
Yeah, and it's so important for that openness. And you hit the nail on the head, that openness of diversity and that openness of understanding people from a different culture. So I like how you brought up with an iOS teaching people how to cook their own food, or even with individuals who there's many cultures that eat with their hands, where if
Yep.
South Asian cultures, African cultures, And to understand that that's the case, or even when looking at cane use or individuals who are guide dog teams, there's cultures who uh, have with dogs belong outside, right? And I'm not
That's right.
saying,
And dogs are dirty creatures. And
yeah,
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 and that's
and
definitely culturally relevant. And understanding, though, that, some people will choose to sort of break that cultural barrier and decide on their
exactly.
own to challenge that. And so I have seen people who are of Middle Eastern descent who are more than happy to become guide dog users, but the way that they deal with them is different than somebody like me. And it's, as long as it works for them and it works within their culture, then absolutely it works. But just the idea that the openness needs to be there and the conversations need to be there, and the idea that, a child, for example, who grows up as an Asian, even in here, yeah, they might learn to use a fork and a knife. But if you asked an ILS professional and you said, look, I want my child to be able to use chopsticks, then that's what they would have to teach. And regardless of their own personal views, they might say, that's not traditionally what we see here or what we do here. But if the parents or the child indicate interest in wanting to learn that skill, and be accommodated, that would be something that I think that an ILS professional has a duty to do. And most of them are quite open to it, and it's great. And
Yeah.
definitely, I would not say that I'm not by any means saying that VLR is not. They definitely, most of the professionals are wonderful people, and they are diverse and dynamic people who are fluid and able to sort of change with the times and understand the evolving identities that people have, and regardless of whether it's gender or cultural. So I mean, my daughter is not of traditional cultural identity, for gender. She's a little different, and that's totally fine. And as somebody of many different identities myself, I totally embrace all of that. And some of my friends, I do have some old world friends, in my building, friends of mine who don't agree with it, and that's fine. But thankfully, she's my child, and I can raise her the way I want. And I always tell her to embrace her differences.
Exactly. And that's the beautiful thing, the
No.
support that you get from family and parent support for sure. And that goes into my next question of being an individual, more identities. So we have you as a Korean ethnicity, a person with sight loss, or a person who lives with blindness, and then the fact who's a Canadian, and then something else, you're a mother of two.
Yeah.
So definitely with that combination of having or living with blindness and then being a mother as well, can you share some of your experiences with that?
Yeah, so I have been a single parent since about 2009, and thankfully, I went through, like, I literally didn't know I was pregnant with my daughter until I was about 7 months along. So yeah, it was how did I not know? Everybody always asks that question. Well, you're pretty good at being in denial when you don't really want to admit uh, something to yourself, and I probably wasn't at the point. I mean, I was 22. So I probably wasn't in that mindset of, yeah, it's possible that I could be a mother. But anyways, so I went, once I found out I was pregnant with her, though, I went full throttle into it. It's just amazing, though, what kinds of sort of people you encounter when you start this journey. And I mean, this is true of any parent, not just somebody with sight loss, but the sight loss adds an extra layer to it that sometimes doesn't factor in when you're looking at just any other parent. So for
Mhm.
example, as soon as I found out I was pregnant, my doctor immediately gave me the third degree about who was going to raise this child. Was it going to be me, or
Mhm.
was it going to be someone else? And how was I going to deal with situation A if situation B happened? And silly little things, like literally the question she asked me was, how are you going to deal with it when you're changing your baby and your baby's on the
Mhm.
change table and your baby rolls off the change table? And it was just like, okay, so think fast. And my answer was, well, I'll change her on the floor then. And actually, after after she grew to be a certain age, that is what I did. And that's what I did with my son too, because it was the safest option and I didn't have to
Mm-hmm.
worry about anyone falling. And then the amazing thing too that happens with parenting and having other sighted people around is the double standard that exists. So I
Mm-hmm.
had some friends who would help me sometimes with the baby when she was little, and also my son when he was little, and they would put them on, an elevated surface like a kitchen table or something like that to change them. And they would go into the kitchen and wash their hands when the baby was on the table. The baby's 1 or 2 months, and I said, I would never do that. I would never leave the baby unattended while I ran off somewhere. And they're like, well, we're just going into the kitchen to wash our hands. And it was like, but you're leaving the baby on the table. The baby has the potential to roll off of it. And
Mm-hmm.
like I said, it's a double standard because when you're sighted, you think you can keep an eye on all of that. Like, there's no problem keeping your eye on the
Yeah.
baby and going and doing something else. But when you're blind, you don't have that option. There's no, even though you do, because we have our ears just as they have their eyes, we can hear the baby and can, you learn very quickly the subtle movements your baby makes and noises that they make. And, if you have constructed the area where they're being changed, the certain sounds. Like I can tell you what toys my son is playing with just by the sound of the toy.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not a noise making toy, if I hear it bang against something or if I hear him with it, I can tell you what toy it is without actually being able to see it. So like I said, it's a double standard because I've had children's aid called on me a few different times for different reasons. In all cases, they literally came, they saw, and they closed the file because there was no need for them to be intervening.
Yeah.
I had someone call in and say that my baby with my daughter was suffering from failure to thrive, which is a condition where a baby is not developing or growing according to their sort of developmental milestones. Not that the milestones are set in stone, but the idea of failure to thrive is that they're not growing and being nurtured. So they're not growing, they're not gaining weight, they're not
Mm-hmm.
eating properly, they're malnourished, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it was funny because when they did show up at the door, at the time, I was literally in the midst of making baby food for her,
Yeah.
and she was coming back with my dad, her grandpa, from somewhere from a daycare. So it was hilarious when they came in and then they saw she had a crib and she was well fed and there was
Mm-hmm.
absolutely nothing wrong with her. And like I said, the files have been closed. I've also been accused of letting her drown in a pool because I took her to the pool. And that was the thing too, is that, yeah, it's a pretty brave thing to do for even someone without sight loss. But because I didn't mention this earlier because I don't like to try to boast, but I was a world-class athlete
Mm-hmm.
and I was ranked 8th in the world in disabled swimming, and I set many records. I was in the 2001 Canada Games, so swimming was something that I know very well.
Yeah.
And so obviously, when I had children, I taught them how to swim. I did obviously enroll them eventually in lessons, but I started them off by teaching them myself. And it's interesting because in a pool, believe it or not, is the easiest place to keep track of your child because it's a
Mm-hmm.
very enclosed space and they're not going to be able to get in and out necessarily easily, especially when they're little. So it's actually one of the coolest places to take your kids when you are blind because you can have pretty much full control over the environment. Um, if you're
Amazing.
comfortable in the water. And so I insisted that my children be comfortable in the water because I am, and because it is, like I said, water and children, very dangerous and scary if they're not. So it's one of those things you want to teach them quite young. So
Mm-hmm.
from the time they were both babies, I had them in the water. And, my son is now 4 and he goes in the pool now with his life jacket and he's able to move about and kick his feet and kind of wiggle around the pool, and which is great. And with him, I've been probably a little bit less paranoid. With my daughter, I was very paranoid. I
Yeah.
wouldn't, if she was in the pool, I literally was like right behind her all the time. With my
Mm-hmm.
son, he can be in the pool and I can be somewhere, I can be on the side of the pool or just in the other end of the pool and not feel like I need to panic.
Yes.
So yeah, like I said, swimming is very important, was very important. But again, the double standard of a sighted person on their phone. And the hilarious thing was I was accused of letting my daughter drown while I was busy playing on my phone. I don't
Mm,
actually take my phone to the pool ever. I
mm,
never have. I never will. So it's kind of amusing when people make accusations like that that are completely baseless, because it's just like, for one thing, she wasn't drowning, because she would I would never let that happen. And for two,
mm,
I didn't even have my phone. So
yeah,
like I said, definitely the level of accusations and the sort of level of investigation that we get for being parents with sight loss is frustrating. But the best way I've learned to combat it is to basically prove them wrong, and to show
exactly.
them, and to be as open and non-confrontational, even though it is extremely hard not to want to lash out at them, because it's very frustrating. It feels so invasive when they come to your door and they ask you questions that are just that make you want to scream. And
Mm,
I, trust me, I wasn't exactly always happy when they were there, and I wasn't always thrilled to see them, but I did realize after thinking about it that to really make them understand who I was and how capable I was, the best way was to prove them wrong. And that's what I did.
yeah,
And that's what I've done my whole parenting journey, basically, is to prove everybody wrong, in the sense that, I always tried to make sure my children were well dressed and clean. Always, and I've been complimented many times when I've taken them to daycares or places, and I've asked the staff there, is she clean? Is her face clean, or is his face clean? Is his hair, does he smell bad? All of those types of things that are important to me, to make sure that my child appears as normal, as if they had a parent from anybody else. And oftentimes they
exactly.
tell me, you do a better job than most of the people we see. So it's kind of nice when that sort of happens, but it is frustrating to feel like you have to prove yourself more than anyone else, and you have to work harder than anyone else to try to be the best parent you can be, to prove to everyone else that you can do it.
Exactly. And then also, I feel like the extra layer on that is being a single parent and having those stereotypes of being a single parent,
Absolutely.
and then on top of having sight loss. And when you were making mention of changing your son and daughter on the floor, it reminded me of a previous guest where they were making mention of, with parenting, it's no real manual to be a
Nope.
parent. And especially when you're a parent with sight loss, and this is a person who came on our show previously, sometimes it's just innate and you just figure ways out to do it. And it's just so innate because that's your child, right?
Yeah. Or you ask people around you, like my
Mm-hmm.
best friend Stephanie, who works for vision loss rehab. She has been amazing in creative ways to accommodate me. So
Yeah.
when my daughter was little and we didn't have a lot of room, we created a baby corral, and we used physical barriers, like furniture, and large objects that she wouldn't be able to move, to create a corral, a safe space that I knew that she could be in and not have to worry. And, it was something that I hadn't even considered. And then
Mm,
also, the one advantage to me raising children and also being a guide dog handler is that because I sort of proof my house for my dog, it sort of helped give me a preview of what I might be doing for my child. So
yeah.
some of the same things that would apply, small objects that you don't want them to mouth, and or heavy things that you don't want them knocking down, stuff like that. All of that applies to children just as much as it does to an animal that you
Mm-hmm.
want to keep safe and you need to sort of keep track of. So but like I said, people, if I didn't know the answer to something, thankfully I was surrounded by some great resources. And as a single parent, I had to learn to become quite resourceful, learning what community supports were actually available and how to access them, and then how to bring them onto my side, and to become part of my team. And definitely when I was raising my daughter, I mean, I was involved with public health, I was involved with Children's Aid, I was involved with Marymount here in London, and I was involved with as many organizations as I could. Nowadays, I'm involved with Safe Families Canada. They're a wonderful organization that help try to help people in crisis and people like myself who are doing it alone, find the resources they need to provide their kids with the best life that they can so that they never end up in foster care. So they're a wonderful organization. But again, I've had to learn these resources. This wasn't just something that came to me. And so you learn very quickly how to ask those questions that elicit the best responses from the midwives, from the doctors, from the healthcare providers. You learn to ask, and you sort of make them scratch their head sometimes, because if
Yeah.
they don't know an answer to it, you make them, dig deep in their resources and go, you know what, this is important. So why don't we look this up?
Yeah.
And it's very important to try to gather as many resources as you can, because you never know who is going to come in handy. I mean, for me, when I moved, because I moved from Ottawa to London after I had my first child, and so obviously the midwife in Ottawa wasn't around for my second birth. However, because we stayed in contact, I asked her what midwifery organization I should choose in London and which one she would recommend. And like I said, resources and networking are all like, that's parenting, that's sight loss, that's advocacy.
Mhm.
It really seems to be a common trend.
And the one thing I really enjoy hearing your story, and it's self-determination, because that could easily break someone's self-esteem and self-confidence, being constantly told, oh, you can't raise a child because of sight loss, or uh, CAS coming in and having these accusations. But uh, that's amazing, the fact that that's advocacy right there, and educating the midwives and educating the doctors and having them see someone who's breaking ground. Maybe that's the first time they witness someone with sight loss raising a child, and just collecting those resources and delivering them and being like, oh, voila, look at this is how it's done, right?
Absolutely. I mean, my son, when he was little, he had a lip and tongue tie, severe lip and tongue tie that had to be corrected. And we had to go to a pediatric dentist to do it with a laser. And it was funny because when she was showing me the exercises I had to do to make sure that it didn't recur, and to ensure that his mouth developed properly, she was showing them to me, and she was saying, I have these sighted moms come into me all the time complaining that, how am I supposed to do these? I can't see what I'm doing. And so she said, now I have a very good, not a way to tell them off, but just I have a very good story for them to understand, to put in
Mhm.
perspective that, yes, you might not be
Mhm.
able to see, but this person lives with sight loss and she's capable of doing the exercises. So there's no reason why you can't either. And she was quite impressed with how well I was able to adapt to the exercises and stuff. And definitely I was the first person she had ever seen who had um, a baby who was totally blind, and was the mother and had nobody else to help, do the exercises and stuff. Cause there's specialized exercises of moving the lips and the tongue and stuff, and bringing it up and down to teach the muscles, how to move around in their new environment. Because obviously when the tongue is tied down, it's used to staying close to the bottom of the mouth. And so you have to
Mm.
bring it up and teach it that, yes, you can go up to the top of the roof of the mouth and stuff like that. So it's kind of
Mm.
neat. But like I said, I've done my best to try to blaze trails in a positive way, and do it by just proving them that we're just like everybody else. And I know for a fact, that's the reason why I chose midwives over an OB. Now, I will say that my OBGYN in my second pregnancy was wonderful because I was in shared care. So, but midwifery, I will tell you that as somebody who was blind going through it, they didn't treat me, they didn't see me as blind. There was nothing that was irrelevant. I was a woman who was pregnant, who was using their services. That was all that mattered. And when it came to breastfeeding and all of that sort of intervention, it was funny because my daughter was born during the H1N1 pandemic. And
Mm.
so I was sick as well at the time. I didn't have H1N1, but I was sick. And I brought her into a walk-in because she wasn't doing well or something. And the doctor had tried to tell me, well, because you're sick, you shouldn't be touching her very much when you breastfeed her. And it was like, well, how am I supposed to breastfeed if I can't touch her? And I'm totally blind. I can't, you can't ask me to do that. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Just like I had a nurse when my son was when I was in the hospital with my son giving birth to him, I had a nurse afterwards who again tried to tell me, no, he's not feeding, not because he doesn't want to, but because your hands are in the way. You have to let him do X, Y, and Z. And it was like, yes, he does, but he also needs to learn how to work with me. And anybody who's gone through that journey will tell you that their babies have to learn just as much as they have to learn how to work with each other. And if it includes sight loss, then it includes sight loss.
Yeah, it's definitely a journey, and definitely aspects that a lot of people wouldn't know about, and just putting two and two together as a mom with sight loss, and just learning the fact that sometimes you have to do ways a little bit differently and have to be adaptable. So that kind of goes into my next question, and I guess I'm gonna try and wrap all your identities in a bowl, which I don't think you can, because there's so many identities and they're so dynamic. But even with having those different identities of being Korean descent, being a female, a person with sight loss, as well as a mother. And then we have to add in the world-renowned swimmer as well. We're going to throw that in there as well. With all those identities said, how does those identities represent your advocacy work? And I know you answered it throughout the podcast.
When I'm on communities, I will say that I feel like when I think about the intersectionality of all my identities, I try to remember that everybody is just as diverse as I am, which means that when I'm on committees and stuff like that with advocacy, when people bring up things that maybe I don't support or endorse or agree with, I have to step back and realize that, you know what, maybe there's a reason why they're pushing just as hard for what they're asking for as I would for something that I really am passionate about. And so to poo-poo them and just sort of be like, no, that's not going to help anybody, doesn't really work. The idea of trying to remember that everybody is just as diverse as another person. So not questioning the reason why they're asking for this sort of thing, not sort of poo-pooing a suggestion or idea they might have just because it doesn't necessarily conform to the agenda that I might have. It's definitely been an asset in that way, and it's like being on the committees that I've been on has really broadened my horizons that way. Because I mean, before, yeah, I did very much look a bit through a lens, pardon the pun, of somebody with sight loss mostly. And so when people who had physical disabilities or hearing disabilities or intellectual disabilities would come up with certain things, for me, it would just be like, well, that's irrelevant. I don't see how that's going to help me. And then as I've, grown up and become more tried to be more open-minded, I've realized that the addition of these extra potential, things that other people bring to the table because of their backgrounds and their disabilities and their identities, that actually brings you to a much broader and better solution for everybody, because you're incorporating everybody instead of just catering to one particular disability. And that's what I mean with accessibility and advocacy, is trying to remember that we should try to think of an inclusive environment for all, not just an inclusive environment for the sight loss community, the deafblind community. Obviously, there are going to be specialized instances where certain things will benefit them more than others, and that's totally normal. But like, my daughter has an intellectual disability, which was something that I had never encountered or dealt with before. And so now when I, do my work, I have to think about things as, how would she be able to process the information? She has trouble reading and understanding information. So, things I take for granted, that the fact that I can read Braille, that's great. But what if somebody is not able to read? There's got to be but at the same time, she's quite capable of interpreting pictures. So the things that I don't take for, like the things that I ignore, like icons, for example, or logos, or on the disabled seating in the buses, there is a picture. There are pictures. There's a picture of a person with a guide dog. There's a picture of a person with a walker, etc. Those
Yes.
types of things that I would ordinarily just have been like, who cares? Why does that matter? And then, it occurs to me now when I look at it, I go, you know what? That actually is really important. Yeah, I might not ever notice it, but it means that my daughter would be able to interpret it. And that's obviously extremely important.
Very, very good points. And when you were talking about working off of a committee or within a group or having an advocacy campaign and considering other people's identities, that really resonated because you don't have too many people making mention of that. And it's not like people just have their own agendas or anything, but with the mentality, human nature, sometimes we think about ourselves and our experience. And while you were saying that, I know back in the day I used to be a Bugs Bunny cartoon. I used to love the cartoon. And it was this part of the cartoon where someone would like walk through a wall, right? And it would create the outline of that person, right?
Yes.
And that's what
Yep.
I see with like sometimes with advocacy, where we walk through that wall and that's our outline, but we have to make
Absolutely.
outline bigger to fit everybody. It's not just us
Yes.
creating that
Yep.
outline. We have to not make an outline and just cut a big doorway through because we have to incorporate all encompassing everybody's identities and how important and something that I also like that you brought up as well as when someone does bring up a concern or something on the agenda, you're not prying and be like, why are we changing that? Why,
Yeah.
right?
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
We need to give, if I'm allowed to have a say, it means that everybody should be allowed to say, regardless of, and it is a struggle. Like, I will admit, it is a struggle. Like, I personally, like with the deafblind community, it is a struggle sometimes. I find it very difficult to understand them, because obviously, because they've never heard before, obviously their speech is going to be different than my speech. And so sometimes that comes into play where I go, it's really a struggle to understand them. So it's not important what they have to say, but that's so wrong. And I've totally changed that, opinion over the years, realizing that that's absolutely the wrong way of thinking. And it's got to be up to me to figure out a better way to understand them, whether it's getting them to repeat themselves, whether it's asking them to write down what they're saying so that I can better understand what they're saying. Because obviously what they have to say is valuable and important and reflects the diversity of the community, rather than just reflecting a few people who are disabled, rather than, and just reflecting a few people instead of everybody.
Yeah, very true, very true. Now, very good points. I honestly, every time I have a conversation with you, Elaine, it's very profound. It even as a program leader of advocacy, it makes me think as well. And I'm glad that you equip me with this critical thinking. It's extravagant for sure. So we are rounding up, and I hate when we do round up because it's always a good conversation. I always learn something new from our guests. So if you could leave the listeners with uh, any last points or comments that you would like to share regarding your identities, advocacy, you as a mother, or even gentrification as well.
Um, I guess really just it's important to be open-minded. And when I mean open-minded, I don't mean just listen, but I mean try to actualize what you listen to. So not just having something like a podcast on in the background and sort of, zoning in and out of it, but actually listening to it and then thinking, how can I maybe try to apply that to my life? Or how could I make that help me to be a better person? And definitely becoming a part of different committees and being involved in your community is a great way to sort of learn the identities of your community as a community and what makes your community special. And um, and then it also helps you provide your own feedback and then, intermingle the feedback of other people and sort of come up with interesting and relevant solutions for community problems or any sort of community type of stuff. We are all, unfortunately, as much as I don't like to say this because I am very much independent, I'm pretty used to doing things on my own. We are community animals. We are community, we are always a part of a community, whether we want to be or not. And there are certain communities where you might want to limit your interactions. Like I personally will admit that I am only coming now into sort of the blind community and really becoming a part of it. And mostly from an advocate standpoint, I don't do a lot of socializing. I don't do a lot of recreational stuff, and that's sort of my. I'm okay with that. That I'm okay with that as being part of myself. Whereas some people really like to do it all, where they like to be involved in the community and they like to work and play in it. For me, it's more work, and I will say that it's important to know yourself well enough to know how much of yourself to give to a community so that you don't feel that you're not getting the right things back. So my last comment I would say is networking and resources are probably your best friends. Definitely, you never know, even if that person on the street that you talk to or you see one day or you have a tiny interaction, you never know if that person is going to be a huge part of your life. And you never know if a study or a research opportunity or anything like that is going to end up coming and helping you out later. I will tell you from experience that I did a research study with a group at McMaster when I was, I believe, in 2006 or seven. And then literally 10 years later, or no, I think it was 8 years later, the head of that study, because I stayed in contact with him, hired me and recruited me to be the consultant for a research project. And that was only because I knew him. And literally, it was just because I knew him, and he knew I had a keen understanding of the blind community. He knew I had a keen understanding of academics and research, and that I loved this sort of stuff. And that was the only reason why. It had nothing to do with him looking through a database of qualified applicants or anything. It was just because he knew me. So definitely, you never know who is going to be that person who will hook you up with you never know what.
Very great points. Very amazing points. I am very hyped up for the advocacy that you're gonna bring up, and I look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you for providing your knowledge, and definitely we'd love to see you on the Lens Living Diverse once again.
Well, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much for having me again. Like I said, I'm very grateful to you that you wanted to hear my story, and that I'm grateful for you, the audience, for listening. And you never know, we might meet someday.
Of course, of course. And then also, you better finish off that Born a Crime book eventually.
Yes, I know.
So we could talk about it.
We can talk about it. Yep.
Excellent. So thank you for listening to The Lens Living Diverse. If you like today's episode or want to listen to any previous episode in the past, you could find us, The Lens Living Diverse, on your favorite platforms. Or if you would like to know a little bit more about diversity and inclusion in terms of sight loss, you could visit the CNIB webpage, go to advocacy, and then go to We Are CNIB, where we have amazing resources. And last but not least, if you have any input or want to be a guest on The Lens Living Diverse, you could email us at advocacy@cnib.ca. Once again, advocacy@cnib.ca. So once again, thank you for listening to The Lens Living Diverse. I was your host, Ben, and everybody take care. Peace.